So how are the court systems set up? Well, typically they're similar. We've got separate state systems and a federal system, but they're kind of set up in a similar fashion, and that is that there are trial courts where most trials emanate, right? Courts of appeals, and then Supreme Courts. Montana may be a little bit different in that our typical trial courts are going to be like our state district courts. Some exceptions to that, and we'll talk about it. And then those appeals from there go right to our Supreme Court. So we really don't have an intermediary court. Again, we'll talk about some exceptions to that. But at the federal level, there are trial courts, which are the federal courts in each state, or in some states, of course, that have heavy populations. They've got a number of federal districts. Montana is one district in and of itself. Okay, we have a few judges that are here, but Montana by itself is one district, and appeals from there would go to a circuit court of appeals, and Montana's in the Ninth Circuit, and ultimately to the Supreme Court. And you've seen in some of the articles, at least that I've posted in the discussions, where we talk about that, or where the articles talk about that, where maybe something on appeal from the Fifth Circuit is going to the Supreme Court, etc. Okay. We'll talk about Montana's in a while. So state courts, right, they have constitutions that set up the court systems. And again, they're pretty similar from state to state. Bigger states, New York, California, Texas, heavily populated states probably have more levels and maybe some different types of courts than we have, but they're still relatively similar. State legislatures establish those or set them up, fund them, do those types of things, and each state has its own rules of procedure, although again they probably are fairly close to what happens at the federal level. So trial courts can be called these different things, right? And it's really not important that you know a difference here. I couldn't tell you the difference myself. In Montana, it's important that you know it. In Montana, our general trial courts are state district courts. Havers and it's Havre and Liberty County and Northern Choteau County, I think, are all a part of the 12th District Court. Okay, and that's where a lot of the trials start. Okay. And then again, if there's an appeal, it would go straight to the Supreme Court. That's where a lawsuit or complaint is filed. And they determine the facts and laws. Again, jury trials, jury would determine the facts, and the judge, him or herself, would determine the law. And then appellate courts generally consist of 3 to 9 judges. They generally just review questions of law. They don't re-look at the facts necessarily of the case, so they won't necessarily look at a jury's decision, but they'll look at how the law was applied or interpreted. Okay. Now, they generally consist of 3 to 9 judges. When we talk about the circuit courts, like the Ninth Circuit, for example, which is California, Washington, Oregon, I think it's Hawaii and Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, I believe. We'll see it later. But, there's about 30 or so justices that are a part of that appellate court. But generally, when a case comes through, it'll get assigned to a smaller group, and generally it's 3, and they would look at that, make a determination, not unanimous, not necessarily, majority rules, and that decision then stands unless it gets appealed. So again, at the state level, small claims courts, and we'll talk about those, they handle litigation between business and customers, and those are, in Montana, those are our justice courts typically. Justice courts are typically kind of a county-wide court. Havre has both a city court and a county court. If you get to some of these counties out in the eastern part of Montana, they probably only have one. They probably have a justice court. They probably don't have a city court, that would take a look at other issues. And they might have a justice court that covers a couple different counties. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that each county at least has its own justice court or county level court, basically. Small claims or minor financial issues that might be, landlord-tenant dispute things. Okay, these are generally informal. Oftentimes lawyers are not involved. Court costs are low, simplified. Both sides usually go. They kind of present their case. It's not completely unlike Judge Judy or whatever on TV. I'm not saying that's an exact representation by any means, but it's not unlike that, where you kind of go, you kind of state your case, and the judge maybe applies some law if need be, but then makes a decision, based on the facts that have been presented. It's a lot less expensive, a lot less hassle, etc. So it works out usually pretty well for those things. We ended up taking a decent number of cases to small claims court. And simply they were low amounts. It was easy. Oftentimes the defendant, in our case, wouldn't even show up, and so we would get what was called a judgment by default. Federal courts are set up through Article 3 of the Constitution. Okay, they review the questions of federal law, obviously. There are certain laws that are strictly federal. I believe kidnapping across state lines, anyhow, became a federal offense, right? So any type of kidnapping that does that is going to go to a federal court. Banks are federally protected right through the FDIC, and so if you rob a bank, you're probably going to end up in federal court. Where the U.S. is a party in it, meaning that maybe one of the departments, the EPA or whatever, is going to file suit or whatever. It's going to end up in a federal court. Disagreements between states. And I think of, is it the Tongue River? But there's a river that comes from Wyoming into Montana, and there's been some dispute because of some gas wells that are on the Wyoming side, and apparently, in addition to gas, they're bringing up some water that has to get taken off, and it's put into the river, but apparently the water's got a high salinity, and so it's creating issues then for ranchers in Montana. Well, there's some disagreements then between the states, and those might be handled in a federal court, including if it's suit between citizens of different states, if the amounts are big enough. Okay, there's the Montana U.S. courts. Maybe that'll tell us who our judge is. I always like to ask that question, so I guess I better see if I can get you the answer. Oh, wow. I'll see if later I can find that. It doesn't want to do it. So the Montana court system, I do have that. I shouldn't. It's not the Montana court system. I'm sorry. It's just our local, basically. Our 12th judicial district, which includes Chouteau Hill and Liberty counties. I don't know if it's all of Chouteau, because that goes to Fort Benton. I think it's maybe northern Chouteau. Our district court judge is the Honorable Daniel Boucher, who is also oftentimes the officiant at the wrestling tournaments that happen up here in northern. Court administrator, law clerk, reporter, clerks of court. Those we don't talk too much about in terms of this. But in Havre, we also, Big Sandy does too. That kind of surprises me. Oh, look at that. See, it's Susan Spencer is the JP and the city judge, and also the city judge for Big Sandy. So my guess is she probably one day a week goes from maybe Fort Benton up to Big Sandy and holds court if need be. Chester, same thing. That would be for Liberty County. You've got the same person as the JP or Justice of the Peace and the city judge. In Havre, we have two, right? Havre's big enough, apparently, or there's enough crime, that we have a city judge who is Virginia Siegel and a Justice of the Peace who is Audrey Barger. And they all stand for election, actually, periodically. So that's who our local courts are, just so we kind of know. I wonder if I could get us to Montana, so I was going to see if I could easily get up with the who the federal judges are. But well, let's stop there, and maybe I'll get a chance to do that, and then I'll show it in the next one when we come back and talk about federal question cases.